Iowa farmers have been crushed by his tariff war with China, and no one knows better than the folks in Iowa.
Thank you, Iowa Farmers Union, for all that you are doing.
The Democratic candidates for president are all using the same four-letter word a lot these days, Iowa. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. The Iowa caucus is just a few days away, high stakes for all of the Democrats. We'll talk politics in a moment. Also on our agenda, 2019, an extraordinary year for financial markets. Prices in just about every asset category moved sharply higher. Two of the Times' top financial correspondents will talk about the market and the outlook for 2020. But we begin with the countdown to Iowa. Voters head to the caucuses Tuesday. The latest New York Times Siena poll shows Bernie Sanders surging, Warren sliding. Sanders in first with 25%, followed closely by Buttigieg, Biden, and Warren. The USA Today poll has Biden on top. CBS, NBC have him in first place. But the ABC News Washington Post national poll shows Biden with a strong lead over Sanders and Warren, with Mike Bloomberg now ahead of Buttigieg. So how important is Iowa this year if Sanders wins Iowa and New Hampshire, but Biden takes South Carolina and Nevada? Does the race essentially start all over again on Super Tuesday in March? And let's not forget President Trump's impeachment trial, which keeps Senator Sanders, Warren, Klobuchar in Washington. What's the political impact of impeachment? Let's talk about it all with Mara Gay, a member of the New York Times editorial board, Jonathan Ellis, senior politics editor at the Times, and Clyde Haberman, a contributing writer for the Times. And on the phone from Iowa, Johanna Barr, senior politics editor at the Times. Johanna, why should we let the farmers in Iowa, as these candidates have been appealing to, pick our next president?
Well, Sam, that's a great question, and it's definitely one that has been debated a lot this primary season in particular, with conversations about, the lack of diversity seen in Iowa and the outsized importance it gets in the electoral cycle. But there's definitely no question that people who live in this state take the role that they have extremely seriously, and you can see that with the hundreds of people who are turning out in the cold to see each of these candidates speak. The focus that they are paying on the race and the amount of conversations that you hear about the different candidates and the pros and the cons. And so, at the very least, it's something that they are taking very seriously. So you can certainly say that.
I don't want to be too self-conscious about this, but are we, the press, taking it too seriously? Do we boost it into something that it really shouldn't be?
Well, that's a great question, and it is important to look beyond and focus on the states that will vote after Iowa. But there's no question that it sets the tone, and it gives you a sense of, beyond the polls and beyond all of the horse race conversation, who's actually connecting, at least with this set of voters. And so it's useful in that respect, I would say.
Mara?
We're in a time right now when politics is being upended, and we're questioning a lot about what institutions are working, what traditions are working, maybe what isn't working. It is quite frustrating, especially sitting here in New York City, where we have over 8 million people, that a state that I believe the population is quite smaller, even than the city's population, has such an outsized role. And I know they take it seriously, but I just think Pete Buttigieg made a statement about heartland voters. It's quite offensive. This really goes to the heart of who is an American and who should have say in our elections. And I can't help but wonder, as a New Yorker, what would happen if we could get those candidates here early. Maybe we could fix our subway. There's a lot of investment that Iowa gets as a state because of all this attention.
Does anyone in Iowa talk about urban issues that would be of concern in the rest of the country? Or are they all talking about, and of course it's important, not only in Iowa, but on a national basis too, issues about farming and imports and exports. Does anyone care about issues of concern in the cities where most of the voters are?
They don't care about none of these campaigns. It has nothing to do with Iowa in this case, Sam. I can't recall ever in any national campaign where pure urban issues have been a major topic, whether homelessness, whether it's mass transit, whether it's the whole infrastructure issue. They didn't come up in 2016. It didn't come up in 2012. And you had two New Yorkers running in 2016 and it didn't happen. You had a former community organizer running in 2008 and 2012 and it didn't happen. And we can keep going back on this. So it's just the nature of American politics. The only saving grace, well, it makes no sense. Most Americans live in cities or right around them, something like 80%. The only saving grace with Iowa this time anyway is that I haven't heard very much about corn-based ethanol being an issue for a change. That's a nice change of pace. But of course the frustration is there. And are we truly to believe that the people in Iowa, bless their souls, and the people of New Hampshire, bless their souls, are wiser than the rest of us, that they're somehow more thoughtful than the rest of us?
They probably have had more time to think.
Well,
Jonathan?
Well, it is interesting that the Democratic Party could change this if they wanted to, but there's this inertia that keeps Iowa and New Hampshire at the front of the calendar. So it's not like, the Electoral College, which certainly has some structural elements to it that give a representation advantage to more rural states, for example. That's going to be pretty hard to change, but the Democrats could change the order of the primaries if they wanted to.
And they have in other cases. When I covered Jimmy Carter's campaign to go way back in '76, the Wisconsin primary was huge. It was very important. I spent the whole month of January and parts of February in Wisconsin. Nobody goes to Wisconsin anymore on this. So there's no reason they can't do the same to Iowa and, for that matter, New Hampshire.
Johanna, the great wisdom, which of course is a truism, is that the outcome all depends on turnout. Why is the turnout, according to the polls at least, for Bernie Sanders going to be that enthusiastic? What is it about him or Iowans that seems to make that prediction likely?
Make that prediction not likely?
Or no, that Sanders seems to be ahead in the polls.
Well, he introduced himself to everybody here when he ran 4 years ago, and he had a very successful campaign here. He came very close to winning the caucuses, and he's building on that now, and there's definitely no question that he has momentum, that people here are excited about him. I went to the rally last Saturday where he was introduced by Michael Moore and AOC, and AOC got a huge reception, and then Sanders got an even bigger one, I would say. There were over 1,000 people there. He appeals to young people. He gets new people excited about the political process. There are a lot of college students here. It's definitely real and on the ground.
Well, Bernie Sanders from Brooklyn, AOC from Queens. I guess there is some New York influence. Let me ask you about Mike Bloomberg. He's obviously running ads nationwide and in some key states. Has he had any presence whatsoever in Iowa?
I mean, not that I've seen, with the caveat that I've spent a lot of my time here in the workroom at the Des Moines Marriott. I was watching TV for an hour or two a couple of days ago, and I saw maybe 12 ads, in some cases back to back, 3 in a row at one point. And I saw, Tom Steyer, I saw Andrew Yang, I saw Amy Klobuchar, I saw Elizabeth Warren. I didn't see Michael Bloomberg. But, we just published today, he came out with his Super Bowl ad ahead of Sunday, and that's obviously going to make a big splash. I know people back in New York are seeing his ads. Just less of a factor here, at least from what I've seen.
Mary, you wrote a editorial column saying that the former mayor, was guilty of hubris. Do you still think he is? Has he gotten over that?
No, I don't think he's gotten over it. I think it's only growing. Listen, I actually don't have an issue with his ads, and I actually think that they're helpful to beat Trump in general. The issue that we had with him is that he seems to think that he can break the rules wherever he goes, and
as he has before, running for a third term.
Run for a third term. So you don't have. So if you're Michael Bloomberg right now, he doesn't feel like he needs to participate in debates or in the first caucuses, or at editorial board meetings, or he doesn't need to release women at his company from anti-disclosure contracts that they've been asked to be released from. That really upsets me. And then he's been mischaracterizing his record on stop and frisk.
It's a little bit like the president saying, if he's doing something, it must be right.
Well, I want to be careful because, I really do look at this as kind of us encouraging him to do a little bit better rather than comparing him directly to Donald Trump. And that's not really fair. I think Bloomberg has a lot to offer voters. And we've seen how quickly he's risen in the polls. I mean, money talks, but also he's got a very compelling story to tell.
We asked Katie Kingsbury this last week on the program. The Times endorsed 2 candidates in the Democratic primary. Is that because the editorial board basically couldn't make up its mind? I mean, it seemed to me as a reader, much less working for the Times, to be sort of self-defeating.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of hubris, I think there is a sense, that folks haven't voted yet. And outside of the political Twitter bubble, I've heard from a lot of people who called and said, hey, thanks for this because I live in Wyoming, or wherever, and I'm not really sure who I want to go with, but this really narrows down the field. And this gives me an option on the left and an option that's a little bit more moderate. And that's kind of what we were going for, but I understand it was unpopular.
Let's talk a moment about impeachment. We're talking before the weekend, before a vote on witnesses or not. Justice Roberts said nobody goes to a ball game to see the umpire, but can we expect him to take a more prominent role in the impeachment process?
No, he hasn't, and we're nearing the end, it would seem. Again, we're taping before they vote, but if things go as we expect, they may vote on Friday, and no doubt to acquit Trump of the charges. And then Republicans, as far as I'm concerned, and many others, will be left with having to defend this position that it was okay for the president to invite another country to interfere with our democracy.
So what do the Democrats gain or lose from having gone through the impeachment process if Trump could say, look, I did this, and Congress, presumably both houses in effect, Congress acquitted me?
He's still been impeached, and there have only been 3 presidents who have been impeached in our history. And I think an awful lot of people would say, let me see, one guy was impeached essentially for an act of a sex act, and this guy's been impeached for trying to undermine our democracy. So Americans, you decide which one is the bigger offender.
We also learned a lot that we wouldn't have learned about the president's conduct and the conducts of those close to him. And some of those offenses may well turn out to be criminal. And so once these folks are no longer in office, assuming that happens at some point, then some of them will be held accountable either criminally or in other ways.
And Jonathan, what more could we expect coming out, regardless of the outcome of the impeachment trial? Still may hear the results of his taxes coming out, other investigations.
Sure, but one thing I would add is that, let's assume that they don't call witnesses. Let's assume that Trump is acquitted. He will obviously, be very proud of the fact that he was acquitted and mention that at his rallies. But there will probably be a political silver lining for the Democrats if the Republicans block the witnesses, because that's going to make it easier for the Democrats to say this was a sham trial. You weren't really acquitted. That we didn't hear the evidence at trial. So assuming that's what's going to happen in the coming days, maybe that's the silver lining.
The one thing I don't understand, and I know I am being naive and a little bit Pollyannish, but how can the Chief Justice, who has presumably latitude because the Constitution says he presides and says nothing else, allow a trial where there are no witnesses, no evidence?
Well, the Senate rules are really in control here, and those rules have not really given the Chief Justice all that much latitude. So I think that's a big part of it. He did one thing this week, which was sort of him taking the reins, which is that there was sort of an attempt through this questioning phase to essentially out the name of the whistleblower, and the Chief Justice refused to read that question. So he's done something, but
so Rand Paul held a press conference anyway.
Sure, but Roberts definitely seems to feel like at least in his mind, he's constrained by the Senate.
Thanks to Mara Gay, Clyde Haberman, Jonathan Ellis, and Joanna Barr of the New York Times. Coming up next, a spectacular 2019 for the financial markets. Will investors be in for a bumpy ride in 2020? We'll talk about it in a moment. 2019, an exceptional year for the markets. You had to try really hard to lose money. Usually when riskier assets like stocks go up, safe harbor assets like bonds go down in value. Not last year. Just about everything rose. Check out these numbers. The S&P 500 rose almost 29%. The tech-heavy NASDAQ up 35%. Gold still up nearly 19%. Bonds rallied almost 9%. We haven't seen an across-the-board rally like that in years. The Federal Reserve helped the markets by flip-flopping from rate hikes to rate cuts. But what about 2020? The year began solidly for markets, but the coronavirus outbreak rattled investors earlier this week, stirred up worries about global growth. Markets hate uncertainty. The virus is exactly that. Let's get the outlook from Stephen Grosser, Dalebook editor at the New York Times, Peter Eavis, business reporter for the Times. Were investors too complacent last year, or did they know something that some of the rest of us didn't know?
Well, I think if you look at the beginning of last year and the beginning of this year and what transpired, you had the Fed reverse course on interest rates, as you said, and start cutting. That provided a lot of support for the market. And then you also had a lot of the concerns that the market was facing, from Brexit to trade, global trade, ease by the end of the year. And that really allowed the markets to rally into the new year. But that has now left the markets pretty pricey. And when markets are pretty pricey, it doesn't take a lot to sort of pop that, and cause a little bit of a pullback.
Peter?
Yeah, one of the things we have to remember about last year, it wasn't just a straight line up.
Yeah.
There was a lot of rockiness along the way. And, a 29% return on the S&P 500 looks great. And a lot of it was caused by what Steve just talked about. But if you think about, how we got there, it was, there was a lot of down days, very big down days. And, those could return now. I mean, particularly because the market is pretty pricey. And that means companies have to perform exceptionally well every time they report earnings. And I think it was yesterday you saw Facebook have slightly disappointing earnings. That's a stock that really drove the NASDAQ up, and it plunged. And I expect to see more of that this year.
How much of that is related to politics? How much is it still the residual effect of the president's tax cuts? How much it is the market rattled by the tariff war and worries about Brexit?
I think if you're looking at earnings and corporate earnings related to the tax cuts, right now for the fourth quarter, earnings are expected to still decline. However, going forward, they're going to the companies are going to have easier comparisons with the year prior, because in 2019, you're going to have 4 straight quarters of shrinking earnings. For the market to stay at this level and maybe continue to rally, you probably are going to need, a return to earnings growth. And by and large, analysts and investors are expecting that to happen.
We see the GDP not growing as much as expected. We see the coronavirus possibly having enormous effects if it keeps getting out of hand. We don't know really what the effects of Brexit are going to be. We have the impeachment and other uncertainties, the Mideast peace plan. Don't these create instability in the market, or are people just, euphoric and don't seem to mind?
Well, I would point to the fact that President Trump has shown that he's willing to go to the edge of what might cause real problems in global markets. He pulled back just in time with the China trade deal and with NASDAQ. With NAFTA too. And we're entering like an election year. I don't expect him to do anything that bellicose on the trade front this year. He obviously wants to win. And I think that he's not going to cause even more friction with Europe, except maybe on Twitter a few times. And I don't think we need growth to be, I think it's going to be somewhere around 2%, as it always is. And I think, even with the coronavirus, and I think if we're looking for things to drive stocks down, then, we might be disappointed. I think the market probably won't plunge. But, so especially in this year when Trump is going to try and keep things safe. So, I mean, we can worry a lot, but that was always the lesson of the last few years. You can worry about all these things. Another thing is Brexit. Brexit sorted itself out. They always do. They always do a deal. And I suspect the same thing will happen at the end of this year when they finally try to get close to signing up at least an interim deal.
I would say, I was just going to say, I think the other thing is we're really back into a similar situation where we've been for much of the past decade. If you look at the GDP number out today and you look at, it's 2%. That's basically where the U.S. economy has been growing for much of last year. You have a central bank, not just in the U.S., but around the world, are back to easing. I mean, this has been a sort of environment that has allowed stocks to grind higher, and that and I think that's a lot of what investors are expecting this year. It's like continued grind higher.
So if the market's going up, what should people be buying? Should they be buying tech stocks? What other categories, at least, if not individual companies, are more likely to go up than others?
Look, we don't tell people what to buy. I mean, it all depends on how old you are, how much money you have, and when you're going to retire, and things like that. I'm not saying that stocks are going to go up a lot as much as last year. I'm just thinking that, I think they're very pricey. Certain companies will disappoint. They will go down. I mean, there is one thing that's out there, again, that's a warning sign, a real one, which is the Treasury bond market is flashing this warning signal that growth is about to slow. I mean, it's been misleading in the past. It's also been on point in the past. That's one thing to keep an eye on. If we do get well below 2% growth, that will translate into disappointing earnings. The market will go down, but I don't see that happening just yet. But again, I don't see another 30% year.
And I think one of the things with the coronavirus, and that's I think what the markets are very focused on right now, and rightly so. Historically, if you look back to SARS, it did not have a dramatic effect on the market. The market recovered. Same with the economic impact with SARS in China. The consumer came back to spending afterwards. But the coronavirus is in a little bit different situation because China is much more important to the global economy now than it was then, and we still are trying to figure out the, just the scope of the impact it's going to have and how widespread it's going to be.
Wilbur Ross says it's good for America. It'll bring more jobs back here.
We'll see where companies are moving the jobs. I mean, that was the argument for the trade war too.
Mm-hmm. My thanks to Peter Eavis, Stephen Grosser of the New York Times, and I'll add my thoughts coming up on CODA next. Take it from me, Ed Koch wrote years ago, hubris is every mayor's greatest danger. Koch knew from personal experience. He suffered from hubris and even confessed his guilt after Rupert Murdoch and other cheerleaders persuaded him to run for governor in 1982. In case you forgot, he lost the Democratic nomination to Mario Cuomo. In that cautionary quote, though, Koch wasn't seeking absolution for his own hubris. He was referring to Rudy Giuliani's. Koch, of course, could be mean in his own way sometimes. He was also prescient. I discovered that again by going back and rereading his 1999 collection of columns titled Giuliani, Nasty Man. Just this week, in his latest outburst, Giuliani accused his former friend, John Bolton, of backstabbing. Giuliani didn't exactly deny that the Trump administration hijacked aid to Ukraine to blemish Joe Biden. Giuliani was mostly unhinged because Bolton hadn't confronted him face to face before merchandising the charges in his book manuscript. Koch's old columns provide a primer to Giuliani's synergy with the president and the irony that their joint resurrection might end in an operatic double whammy. Here are some Koch insights worth repeating. Quote, Giuliani is engaging in what he does best, character assassination and brutalizing his critics. He doesn't defend his positions with his arguments, but rather seeks to destroy a perceived opponent with invective. He believes in terrorizing those who exhibit independence or have opposing views. Leadership based on fear breeds resentment and mounting anger. Rudy cannot admit error. He is a bully, a petty and vindictive tyrant. I believe we are seeing a Greek tragedy unfold, Koch wrote. His tragic flaws, hubris, and a compulsion to blame others for errors are bubbling to the surface. In that spirit, Koch invoked the Greek historian Heraclitus. Character, he said, is fate. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.